Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program. We're happy to see you, even if we can't technically see you. But I just wanted to welcome you all. And before we get started, I wanted to give just a couple of logistical announcements for tonight. First of all, my name is Annie Black. I am the Director of Programs and Volunteers at the museum. And tonight, we are so thrilled to have Madeline Hsu with us from the University of Texas at Austin. We will have plenty of time at the end of the program for questions. So if you want to go ahead and locate your Q&A button, it's probably going to be at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet, you might see it at the top, but you can open that function, go ahead and type your question right into that chat box, and we will answer all the questions at the end. If you do have a question during the program, please feel free to go ahead and type it in just while you're thinking of it. So without further ado, I'd like to start by welcoming Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Mary Pat?
Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'm so excited to welcome you all this evening to our virtual presentation with Dr. Madeline Hsu. First, I'd like to thank you for sticking with us during these uncertain times and for joining us for so many of our virtual programs. I'd also like to thank Annie Black and Spencer Cronin for their incredible work to get our virtual programs up and running just a week after we had to close the museum. It's been so heartening to continue to connect with our community and beyond. We've actually had quite a few people watching our programs from beyond the Metroplex, so that's been pretty exciting. I hope you will join us for more programs in the weeks to come. Be sure to visit our website to see what we have coming up next. I'd like to give a big thank you to our event sponsors for this evening, Haynes and Boone and Northern Trust. Your support means so much to us. And thank you to our community partners for this evening, Communities Foundation of Texas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Reach of Dallas, and SMU Human Rights Program. I'd also like to say a big hello to our museum members joining us this evening. Your support means the world to us, now more than ever. I can't wait until I can see your smiling faces in person. And finally, a big thank you to all of our board members who have been so supportive of our team, especially during this crisis that we are all figuring out how to navigate. I can't ask you to raise your hand tonight, but I know several of you are listening. Thank you. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Madeline Hsu as part of our permanent exhibition highlight series. This series gives an in-depth look into different parts of our permanent exhibition. From tonight's program on Asian American rights, a strand featured in our Pivot to America gallery, to next month's presentation on the women's suffrage movement. We hope you will keep an eye out for these programs and join us on this journey. Dr. Madeline Hsu is a professor of history at the University of Texas, go Horns, and former director of the Center for Asian American Studies. Her most recent book, The Good Immigrants: How the Yellow Peril Became the Model Minority, received awards from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, and the Association for Asian American Studies. She is also the author of Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, Transnationalism and Migration Between the United States and South China, 1882 to 1943, and Asian American History, a very short introduction. And she's also co-editor of A Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, U.S. Society in an Age of Restriction, 1924 to 1965. Dr. Hsu is president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and vice president of the International Society for the Study of Chinese Overseas. As Annie mentioned, we will leave time for questions at the end of Dr. Hsu's presentation. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your question. Now, please help me welcome Dr. Madeline Xu.
Thank you, Mary Pat, and thank you, Annie, and thank you, Spencer. And I am so grateful for this opportunity to be speaking with the Dallas Holocaust Museum's audience and community. And this coincides with Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And I really appreciate just the vision of this museum and its administration in recognizing that human rights is an issue that cuts across all races and nationalities and backgrounds. Now I'm going to be, I have a pretty lengthy PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing with you now. I will try to move through it quickly. It covers all Asian American populations. But as Mary Pat has said, that there will be time for questions later. And so this is based largely on my most recent monograph, The Good Immigrants, but I've extended it to be talking about Asian American history more generally. I also have a lot of background in general immigration history if you want to ask more questions after the talk is over. So I thought I would start the lecture with this image from the 1870s. Now, in the 1870s, the United States was experiencing its most extensive economic depression up to that point within the nation's relatively young history. And you can see that it captures very powerfully this sense of invasion. And here it is specifically Chinese coming into the port of San Francisco. You can see this outlined here from the setting sun of China, just shipload after shipload, and this clear sense of invasion and of being overwhelmed. Also a sense of the extensive economic activities being pursued by Chinese on the West Coast. And so for Chinese, as with so many European immigrants, North America, the United States, was a land of opportunity. China was encountering serious problems, and so they were very motivated to go elsewhere and just try out and see what they could make of themselves. Very famously, Chinese come over for the gold rush. They helped to build the railroads, but they were also just really critical to the developing of California agriculture, which is a major industry there. But they came not just as sort of everyday workers, they were also interested in business opportunities. And so you can see kind of the level of enterprise here involved in the making of cigars, laundries, they're very famous for, also restaurants. And so very, very productive economically. However, because they were viewed as being racially different, inassimilable, and in ways sort of completely unsuited to become and unable to become American citizens, their presence and the contributions, in fact, come to inspire significant levels of hostility and concern and anxiety, as invoked in this image here. And as expressed by the hissing cat of public opinion in this slide. And so I show this to make understandable that, in fact, when the United States as a young country decides to embark systematically on immigration regulation and restriction, the earliest targets, in fact, are Chinese. Even though at that time in the 1870s, they were only 0.02% of the national population, nonetheless, they were seen as a significant threat and seen as essentially and fundamentally unabsorbable into the United States. This is an image taken from The WASP, which was a California publication. California, which was home to 70% of all Chinese in the United States, was also the center of the anti-Chinese movement. And this image here captures in very stark terms the kind of threat posed by Chinese workers to the white American working class man. And you see here, he has committed suicide because he is unable to find work. He is driven to desperate circumstances because of competition against Chinese, as captured here in the view outside the window. He cannot get a job. He cannot support his family. His son, in desperation, has gone onto the streets and stolen a loaf of bread and been picked up by a police officer. His daughter has become addicted to opium and seems likely to have become a prostitute, and his wife is in utter despair. And so the conflict was pitched in these terms that the coming of Chinese workers who, because they mostly came as single men, although they were supporting families back in China, could take lower wages. And so the white working class male trying to support their families were driven out of work. And this would be an undermining of this foundation stone of the United States. A key question that is posed in terms of thinking through whether or not the United States should make this significant turn in national history and for the first time start to systematically and intentionally try to restrict immigration to prevent certain people from coming to the United States. The key question is put forth in this image from the magazine Harper's Illustrated Monthly, which was read across the nation. And the key question is, can the Chinese coolie? And so Chinese were stereotyped racially as being these coolies who were seen as being akin to a new form of slavery, that they were unfree workers, that they were sort of debased, they were willing to accept lower wages and worse working conditions. And so you can see how they are represented in this cartoon as, in fact, not a very human looking character, much less one willing to stand up for himself against this crowd of men here wishing to attack them and being opposed to their presence. And the key question is whether such a person, such a creature really can sort of assimilate enough to become Americans. And it's important to remember that the United States is a democracy. It's a republic, which means that people who immigrate, or actually specifically men who can immigrate, eventually can become citizens and can participate as equals in American democracy. For this, you want people who are sort of free and independent thinkers. And the question is, can this creature cowering here ever be a free and independent thinker and actor in his own rights to the extent that he can participate in United States democracy? And so here you can read the caption that accompanied the original cartoon, The Chinese Question, Colombia. And Colombia here is represented by this woman who represents the ideal of the republic, of a society for free and equal men, is saying to this crowd, hands off, gentlemen, America means fair play for all men. But the question, obvious question being asked, especially if you look at the posters against which they're standing, the obvious question is, does fair play really apply to such a creature as this? Ooh, sorry. And you can see the ways in which Chinese were perceived as being coolies and slaves. They were seen as being barbarians, idolaters. They were non-Christian, degraded labor, vicious and immoral. Does this kind of person actually deserve fair play? Now, the creator of this cartoon, Thomas Nast, was himself a German immigrant, and he actually had a more complicated view of matters, because if you look at the crowd to which Colombia is speaking, it is actually a mob of angry, armed men. And in the background, you can see an evocation of the United States' very troubled racial history. You see a tree bearing a noose evoking lynching. You see this building here is actually the Colored Asylum. This was burned in 1863 during the Civil War. And against this background of this evocation of the United States' very troubled and violent history of not being able to accommodate multiple races races of peoples, this question takes on a more sophisticated light. Should the United States, in fact, allow admission of a new race of immigrants when it clearly is seems unable to accommodate those races that are already present in North America? And this illustration here shows us what happens in the past. In 1882, the Chinese restriction law is passed. And here you can see a sort of a lineup of ethnic stereotypes in the United States. I think the lead person is Irish. In fact, Irish immigrants were major figures in the anti-Chinese movement, followed by an African-American figure. I'm not sure what the ethnicities are of the other workers, but you can see the bricks that are being brought together: prejudice, laws against race, jealousy, competition. And here you may not be able to see this so clearly, but this gentleman putting everything together is applying congressional mortar. Immigration regulation is a matter of federal authority, and so it has to be Congress that passes the immigration laws. And so the wall is going up on the US, and even as we see on the other side, the Chinese wall is coming down, and sort of countless masses of Chinese waiting to try to come over to the United States. And so this is where immigration regulation in the United States begins. These are the legal foundations. The federal government and the executive branch will soon be also developing sort of strategies and approaches in terms of enforcing the immigration laws. The Chinese Restriction Act identified Chinese by race, and here I have a listing of the laws here, so we can look at this. The Chinese, it will come to be known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. It will racially identify Chinese for restricted entry. Chinese are the only group to be identified for race as being restricted to come into the United States. There were a narrow set of exemptions, including merchants and merchant family members. Now, so this is how the immigration laws start. It will soon, the federal government will soon tackle other targets, other Asian groups, and that's what I'll focus on today. There will be laws sort of restricting immigration by the poor, but that's not going to be our main focus here. Japanese start coming in significant numbers in the 1890s, and after the Chinese restriction laws become permanent in 1904, Japanese begin to be targeted by the Anti-Asiatic League. And they will be sort of attacked in terms of attending integrated schools. In particular, Japanese success in terms of farming in California will become targeted and form a key part of the platform of James D. Phelan, who will successfully gain office into Congress on the basis of his steady campaigns to try to limit and try to expel Japanese from the United States. He will keep on applying pressure so that to try to limit the settlement of Japanese and also their immigration into the United States. There will also be starting the turn of the 20th century, we will have sort of a few thousand South Asians also experiencing racialization as a form of yellow peril, of having a different kind of religion, of being unwanted labor competition as well. And so we will have a series of laws that target Asians as a race. We've already talked about the Chinese Exclusion Acts. The core of this perception and then also legal treatment of Asians as being essentially foreign actually dates very early back to the history of the United States as a republic. All the way back to 1790, the Nationality Act, which was the first law passed by Congress to set the terms for what immigrants coming to the United States can become citizens by naturalization. Naturalization is the legal process, and also what are the conditions for this. Now, from from 1790, Congress limited this right to free white persons. Those are the terms written into the law. In practice, this meant white male property owners. And so if you think about it, this is somebody who looks a lot like the members of Congress at that time, which makes sense that if they have a democracy, they will want people who are like them. However, it then means that Asians, as being non-whites, and actually many other groups of non-whites, cannot get citizenship. It is used to create a legal category, aliens ineligible for citizenship, which will be used for discriminatory legislation into the mid-20th century, so really for most of US history. But this racial limitations on who can get citizenship by naturalization effectively means that for most of US history, no Asian immigrants could become US citizens. This racial discrimination is not fully removed until the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act. Now, there is a kind of logic to then try to restrict the immigration of persons who categorically are not allowed to get citizenship in the United States. And so those two are closely bound together in terms of the kinds of regulation we make about immigration and citizenship. Furthermore, the laws, the immigration regulations applied to Chinese will then also become the basis for the US federal government figuring out how you actually enforce the laws. And it was in trying to make sure that immigration regulation against Chinese was being upheld that the federal government then acquires the rights to detain aliens, non-citizens who in the United States without authorization. They are subject to detention and deportation. So these have become sort of very, very visible in the 21st century landscape. This is being deployed extensively. The roots of this go all the way back to the 1890s and the enforcement of immigration laws against Chinese. The main sort of so there's a steady loss of rights of Chinese in the United States with regard, because they are mostly immigrants at this time. The main toehold that Chinese gain is the 1898 Supreme Court case of Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States, and this is the case that sets precedents whereby if you are born in the United States, according to the 14th Amendment, you have citizenship by birth. And so Chinese actually do win this case, and this is the precedent-setting case. With other Asian groups coming to the United States in more significant numbers, actions are taken to also restrict their coming. Japanese undergo restriction with the 1907-1908 Gentleman's Agreement. This was actually a diplomatically negotiated agreement. The Japanese government agreed to self-restrict and prevent Japanese laborers. This was the key targeted class, as with the Chinese exclusion laws. It particularly did not want laborers coming over to the United States. South Asians, actually most of Asia will, most Asians will face immigration restriction with the 1917 Immigration Act. Its key term actually was to impose a literacy standard intended to reduce immigration from Europe. But while Congress was at it, Congress decided to go ahead and just designate a barred zone. And so this is the map from the congressional record, and you can see here the delineation of the barred zone, which, clarifies, makes very stark just sort of the association of people who come from different parts of the world with being of different races and therefore of different cultures and civilizations, but also of being essentially of different biological makeup, right? And this is, of course, sort of building on Darwin's theories of evolution, has evolved evolved into social Darwinism, but this sort of stark belief that people who come from different parts of the world are biologically different, they're unequal, some people are inferior, and that you should not have racial mixing. One of the ways of understanding this or explaining this was the justification that if God had intended different races of people to sort of intermingle and intermix, he wouldn't have put them on different parts of the world. Right, but you can see from this map that really the 1917 Act takes a sort of a huge chunk of the world, including I think about a third of the world's population, and just sort of summarily says nobody from this part of the world can enter the United States. And it's a sweeping measure, but by this time there is such great consensus about wishing to limit immigration only to white persons. This undergoes further refinement in 1924. In 1924, Congress is very, very isolationist by this time, passes the 1924 Immigration Act, which imposes a system of national origins quotas. So it's basically your ability to immigrate into the United States is really based on the nation that you come from and your race. It bans altogether all immigration of aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? And so it extends this even further to just sort of go all the way from what is now considered West Asia and all the way through East Asia, now including Japan. And so it's a sweeping measure, the most restrictive immigration laws in national history. This, of course, met with a lot of complaint from countries and peoples who then had almost no possibility of immigrating legally into the United States. Okay, so this is the expanding reach of US immigration. You will notice here that in the barred zone, the Philippines is actually sort of outside of the barred zone. And this is because technically, since 1898, the Philippines has been a US territory. Formally, it is part of the US empire. And so the United States could not ban Filipinos from coming to the United States, even though there will be rising levels of anti-Filipino agitation. So Filipinos will continue to come to the United States in part because they are heavily recruited along with Mexicans by the 1920s to work in agriculture, particularly in the Southwest and the West Coast. The United States will end up limiting Filipino immigration by promising the Philippines eventual independence. But it is sort of a categorical setting aside of Asians as unwanted, as being unable to become incorporated into the US nation. Now, this was not sort of a monolithic view, because if we think about sort of the complexities of human beings and the human races, one of the things we can readily agree on is that, in fact, race is a faulty measure of individual capacity. So, for example, here, I think we could pretty much agree that this kind of bug-like creature representation of the Chinese coolie is not somebody we would exactly want to welcome into the United States. And here we have both the Republican and the Democratic parties being able to agree on that. However, frankly, not all Chinese are the same. And some Chinese, these two young men here, in fact, Li Zhengdao and Yang Zhenning here are Nobel Prize winners in physics. And they come to the United States in the 1930s and 1940s as students. They are the first ethnic Chinese to win Nobel Prizes, and they really challenge this notion, and they really require reconsideration of the primary emphasis on race and national origin that has sort of been the main criteria by which US immigration laws had been sort of allocating rights to legal immigration and citizenship. And so from 1882 through 1965, the main principles used to decide who should immigrate into the United States legally focused on race and national origins. However, that's not necessarily the sort of the best criteria for figuring out how do we discern which immigrants will actually be beneficial and useful and become good citizens in the United States. And so Chinese, such as T.D. Lee and C.N. Yang, that's how they're better known in English, really force some reconsideration of how the United States, what it is prioritizing in terms of its immigration regulation. Now, World War II will also serve to significantly shift these kinds of views. In World War II, China is the United States' chief ally in the Pacific theater, in the war against Japan. During the war here, the image that I show here is Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who was the wife, US educated wife of China's leader, Chiang Kai-shek. She was educated in the United States. She was second generation Methodist back in China, considered very beautiful, very intelligent, speaking to Congress on China's behalf. Now, one of the considerations in World War II is the Chinese ask, and also the Japanese government also presses with this campaign to woo China to change its alliances and to side with Japan on a racial basis. And what Japan points to is the Chinese exclusion law, and it questions how China can consider the United States a friend if the United States will not even allow Chinese into the United States, treats them very harshly and critically, and will not even allow them to have citizenship. Under these kinds of pressures of war and international alliances, Congress actually very quickly repeals the Chinese exclusion law. And what happens is that instead Congress goes ahead and treats China like every other country that has an immigration quota, which because there are so few Chinese in the United States means that China has a quota of about 105. Chinese are the first Asians to gain citizenship rights, but from a certain way of thinking about it, Chinese are no longer subject to immigration discrimination. Now, other things that happened in World War II is that there were about 12,000 so-called stranded students in the United States. It's too extensive to go into here, but whereas we didn't like Chinese laborers, we highly welcome Chinese students, and actually Chinese international students coming to the United States helped to establish the foundations of international education in this country. And to this day, they are still actually, in fact, the most numerous of international students on US campuses. Now, what happens is that over the course of the Sino-Japanese War, this was World War II for Chinese, and then also the Chinese Civil War that took place right after World War II, is that China becomes communist by 1949. All of these events and upheavals has the effect of turning all of these very elite Chinese students in the United States into refugees. They need a new home. Are you going to send people like T.D. Lee and C.N. Yang back to communist China into the arms of the enemy simply because they are Chinese? Would it not make more sense to keep them in the United States? Now, this conflict, the sense of prioritizing people with sort of technical and scientific expertise, with sort of useful education and useful skills, is exacerbated by the Cold War, in which the United States is in competition with the Soviet Union, with the communist bloc in the defense race, in the space race. And in 1957, it looks like the United States is in fact losing the space race. And so this puts even more emphasis on sort of dismantling the racist immigration laws. This is also a barrier in terms of the United States trying to gain support among newly established third world nations. There's decolonization of most parts of the world, and we have these new nations of people who are mostly Black and brown. And the United States is having problems persuading the peoples of these countries that the United States is the better bet, has the better system, more representative and inclusive with these kinds of immigration regulations that discriminate on the basis of race and national origins. Ooh, wrong direction. So this is a graph which just sort of select information about international students to the United States. The records start being kept more systematically only in 1923, 1924, although we see more of a phenomenon like this into the 1900s. But if you look at this, what you'll notice is that even though we have Chinese exclusion in place through 1943, counterintuitively, Chinese are almost always among the top 2 or 3 countries sending international students to the United States. So there is a contradiction at work here. What you can also observe is that after 1945, international students coming to the United States steadily increase. And we can see that also in this graph here. International education becomes a key component of U.S. soft diplomatic efforts overseas, that the United States understands that it's actually an effective strategy to cultivate relationships with other countries by sort of being welcoming and helping international students, especially future leaders of their home countries, to come study in the United States and then go back and help develop their countries to be in sort of in collaboration with the United States and friendly to the United States. And so we can see this in terms of overall enrollments of international students in the United States. We can also see shifting percentages in terms of international students in this country. Let's see, and so this text-heavy slide here sort of lists out the easing of American immigration restrictions against Asians. So we have the 1943 repeal of the Chinese exclusion law. 1946, the same terms will be applied to Filipinos and Indians, also allied with the United States during World War II. The General Immigration Law, McCarran-Walter Act, is the one that finally ends the racial discriminations in terms of citizenship by naturalization. It also, it retains the discriminatory national origins quotas, but it allows any country as it comes into being, if it's recognized by the United Nations, to have an immigration quota. That had not previously been the case. It also enacts for the first time certain preferences. Now, this 1965 Immigration Act operates on the basis of preferences. In 1952, we see for the first time preferences for skilled workers and then also family reunification. It does retain a racial discrimination against Asians in terms of imposing the Asian Pacific Triangle that tracks Asians by race, birth, and caps their overall immigration at 2,000. So there's still a sort of a restriction against Asian immigration. We'll talk more about the 1965 Immigration Act and an expansion on its employment criteria in 1990 in later slides. But it is the 1965 Immigration Act that finally gets rid of the national origins quotas. It gives every country the same immigration quota, and then it implements this preference system emphasizing 3 legal routes to immigration into the United States: family reunification, employment, and then also for refugees. Now, this is the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act. This is implemented after sort of, so every single president after World War II, regardless of political party, is pressing for immigration reform. This includes Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. It's really Kennedy that develops this set of terms for the immigration regulation, but it takes Lyndon Johnson sort of building on the impact of Kennedy's assassination, and Johnson being a very, very skilled operator in Congress to actually get it through Congress. It is very difficult to pass general immigration law, which is something we're dealing with now. But here you can see the uniform caps for all countries. Preference system: 75% of all legal immigration visas go on the basis of family relationships, spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens, siblings, parents. Only 20% goes to employment and 5% to refugees. But so if you stop and think about it, unless you have a relatively close relationship to a US citizen, or you are the spouse or minor child of a person with a green card, somebody who has managed through skilled employment. These are in categories designated by the Department of Labor as being needed in the United States. Unless you qualify through these routes, there is no legal path to immigration into the United States. Effectively, most people in the world, in fact, do not have a legal pathway to immigrate. Another major change with the 1965 Act is it's the first time there are quantitative numeric caps on migration within the Western Hemisphere. A considerable portion of the immigration problems we have in terms of enforcement now pertain to this aspect of the 1965 law. Now, what will happen is that, so Congress's expectation when they passed this is that most of the people who came to the United States would continue to be white, and so to come from Europe. In 1965, about 85% of the US population was of European ancestry. The expectation with the emphasis on family reunification is that would continue. But what happened is that, in fact, Europe recovered pretty well from World War II. Those parts of Europe that did not recover that well were part of the communist bloc, so they couldn't come to the United States. And so what happens instead is that Asians are highly motivated to come to the United States. Their countries are poorer, they're less stable. If they can get to the United States as students, those expanding international education programs, they actually have ways in which they can get legally employed and then stay in the United States through the employment preference. Okay, and so Asians will begin to immigrate disproportionately through the skilled employment preferences, right? And so we will have not only an increase in Asian immigration, but we will have them be disproportionately of the higher educated especially in STEM fields. So people would major in STEM fields knowing that this would make it easier for them to get jobs and then be able eventually to immigrate in the United States. But this is one reason why Asian Americans display these characteristics, these attributes of being model minorities, which is because of that is the only way that they could legally immigrate. They had to be, very well educated in the first place, even to be able to gain a pathway to legal immigration. So they pretty much arrive in the United States as model minorities, and then this kind of cultural capital tends to be transmitted from one generation to the next. They will tend to make sure that their children, next generations, are also very well educated. So this is why we actually have aggregated statistical data which shows much higher levels of achievement in terms of education, household incomes, and employment categories. Okay, I am actually running out of time, but I will try to summarize very quickly. And so here, this chart shows us an overview of immigration to the United States. And you can see for most of US history, in fact, most immigrants have been from Europe. That is the blue portion. In fact, it is Germans who sort of across US history that have come in the highest numbers. But then we see a transformation in terms of immigration. So here, this is the effect of those national origins quotas, steep drops in terms of immigration to the United States, slowly creeping back upwards, but then here you can see it going back up, and transformation, yellow, and then also orange. And now the two major immigrant groups come from Asia, which you'll see here is a huge block, and then also from within the Americas. This is another way of capturing this. So if we compare before the 1965 Act, these are the countries that send the most immigrants. Before it was England, Germany, Canada, and Mexico. After 1965, it comes Mexico, and then Asian countries and some Central American countries. So there is a dramatic shift in terms of who is immigrating to the United States. Some of this has to do with motivation. Migration is very much driven by economic forces, but then also legal pathways. Is there possibilities of family reunification? So family reunification actually remains the dominant legal immigrant story. That's how most people get to immigrate to the United States. This is another graph that shows us, breaks out, gives you a sense of how disproportionately Asians immigrate to the United States. This is sort of the chartreuse green via the immigration categories. Sorry, in terms of employment. I'm going to move through this very fast. This phenomenon is called brain drain. And so here, this is data from 1967. The J1 visa, the F1 visa is the student visa. And what you can see here then is that by far, the majority of persons arriving on student visas who convert to immigrant status are from Asia. The big sending countries are China, Republic of China, at this time it's actually Taiwan. India is a big source. And then the next biggest source would actually be South Korea, right? So these are the main countries that are sending highly educated people over to the United States to study, who then remain in the United States and become immigrants. The possibility of coming to the United States via employment is expanded with the 1990 Immigration Act, which creates the H-1B visa program, which sort of expands the number of visas for skilled workers. And you can see, even though this is race-neutral language, for example, in 2011, 70% of all recipients were born in Asia, 60% in India, right? We can also see this mapping onto kind of who is getting graduate degrees in science and engineering programs. Very, very high percentages are of ethnic Asian students. We can see the brain drain effect. And so in terms of the model minority attributes, this is actually most visible among Asian Indians who, in part this is because in 1960, there were so few Asian Indians in the United States, only about 12,000. And so most of the Asian Indian population who are now here have come through the 1965 Immigration Act, and mostly through the employment categories, as we can see from the statistics here. So, but we can think about what this means in terms of a skimming effect. So 81% of Asian Indian adults have college degrees in the United States. But if you compare this against the general Indian population back in India, only 10% of the Indian population has some opportunity to just take classes in higher education institutions. And so you can see the ways in which the US immigration laws, in fact, are working as it's intended, right, to really bring sort of the most elite of Indians and allow them to immigrate into the United States. I'm not going to go into this part. There was a reframing of Asians as model minorities. A lot of this focuses on sort of high levels of educational attainment. This is one Taiwanese family in Flushing who all three sons go to Harvard. Not only do they all go to Harvard, they are all valedictorians. Here's an image of sort of the high percentages of Asian students on the campuses of elite institutions, all in the sort of presence, particularly in certain tech sectors. Okay, and so these are tables that sort of capture the increasing presence of ethnic Asians and Asian Americans, international students in higher education campuses. This is just this is a disaggregated set of data. So it's not even across all Asian groups. As I said before, Asian Indians sort of display these characteristics the most, followed by Chinese and Filipinos, also Koreans and Japanese. Let's see. All right, but so, and this is also another way of looking at it. Very different information if you look at different Asian groups. Some of this depends on educational attainment, which varies by Asian group, ethnic group, and then also on English language proficiency. But I won't go into these in detail. I could return to the slides if you want to during the question session, as we are running out of time. This slide just also captures differences in English language proficiency, which also impacts sort of employment patterns and then household incomes and so forth. This is employment distribution. I think I will just end on this slide here, which shows us that in roughly 2009, in part due to the economic downturn, but also sort of attitudes towards immigrants, Asians have overtaken Hispanics as the most sort of fastest growing immigrant group in the United States. And this has remained roughly true. It's projected that by 2065, Asians will be sort of the largest immigrant population in the United States, which is sort of an extraordinary shift. And despite our sort of prevailing kind of very high levels of nativism and hostility to immigrants, the shift from Hispanic to Asian immigrants has as being sort of the primary. If we contrast this to the attitudes in the 1870s and 1880s, when, you know, such minute presence of Asians roused such sort of fierce anxiety and opposition, you can see how completely there's been a transformation in terms of perceptions of Asians as model immigrants. They still remains significant strands of hostility and discrimination. We can see this especially within the past few months as sort of the fears of the COVID-19 have become very much racialized. There's been a sharp uptick in terms of anti-Asian attacks and hostility, but nonetheless, there is sort of been a significant remaking of the Asian population. So I'm just going to wind down here. I'm going to leave you with this slide, which gives you further resources about immigration history. This is, so Teach Immigration History has a sort of an extensive chronology. It has a thematic explanation of different aspects of immigration history, both, you know, say about immigration and labor, Asian American, European immigration. But so perhaps Spencer and Annie could share this with you later on. This is the New York Times website. It allows you to look historically at different immigrant groups and where they were settling in the United States at different stages of US history. And this one is kind of fun. It shows us, it allows you to follow a specific immigrant and actually help make decisions alongside them of what sorts of choices they should make in terms of finding their way into life in the United States. Okay, I'm going to end the stop share and then I can take your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Madeline. You covered a lot in that 40 minutes. That was amazing. But we do have some questions coming in. So our first one, someone would like to hear a little bit more about how Johnson was such a skilled negotiator to get that immigration reform passed. If you have anything you could add to that.
So immigration reform had been blocked for decades at the committee level. And so some key, and so, I mean, I think it's helpful to recognize that immigration regulation is sort of one of the most direct areas where you can just sort of say, okay, this is what we think the American population should be. This is who we think American people should be, like the kinds of people we want to include, right? And, you know, and it actually affects many, many different sectors of American life, right? And so, some people think that we should just have completely open doors. Anybody should be able to come as a matter of human rights. Other people will say, no, we want to keep out, obviously, people who are criminals, people who will be detrimental to the United States. Others, you know, have conceptions of what are the kinds of people who are sort of most compatible with life in the United States. A lot of times assimilability is a key criteria, right? And so there's a lot of different ways in which you could parse this out. And so it's hard to come to agreement even about our priorities. Now, but in practical terms, the immigration regulations have to go through the committee system of Congress. And so for decades, this was sort of controlled by a group of very restrictionist Southerners, mostly sort of committed to the Jim Crow South. And this is why it got blocked out. This is why, you know, Kennedy actually really hesitated to bring the legislation before Congress because he knew how difficult and challenging it would be. And so, but after Kennedy is assassinated, Johnson makes this commitment that he will sort of pursue Kennedy's platforms, right? So the civil rights bills and also the immigration law. And so it takes Johnson, who understands Congress. He knows who he can strong arm, whom he can pressure. He also is himself from the South. And he's the one who manages to get enough votes to get it through Congress, right? It actually passes pretty well. But one of the sleights of hand that happens is that they point to the emphasis on family reunification, right? 70% of the immigrant visas. This means that most of your immigrants, and they actually tell this to Congress, are going to look very much like past immigrants, right? That there won't be that many changes in terms of the ethnic and racial composition of the United States. We have a multitude of people, including Ted Kennedy, Emmanuel Seller, for whom the bill is named, making this promise. We can make the laws more egalitarian, more equal on their surface, but immigration will stay the same. Of course, they were wrong. Right? The law gets passed, there's this complete transformation. It's because people in Congress didn't understand how important things like economic disparities, right? And then political instability are drivers of migration. By this time, many Europeans had no need to migrate, right? It's also true for Japan. This is why Japanese immigration reduces. And it's because after World War II, the United States actually invested in these countries. It helped them rebuild their economies, but it meant that people weren't as interested in coming to this country. So.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I have one question, because I know you had mentioned maybe we can make that last slide available to folks. If for everyone listening, if Madeline's okay with sending that to me, we'll make sure we get that to you all after this
I'll get
talk.
the information to you. And yeah, I mean, there are different ways of learning about sort of, it's a really complicated history. Yes.
Great. Our next question is a little bit of a chicken and egg question, I guess. Which came first, the model minority or immigration preferences for students and professionals?
So a lot of times I didn't talk about this much in the talk, but the model minority is often associated with Japanese American history, right? And Japanese Americans, as many people know, were incarcerated during World War II. By and large, complied with the incarceration order. I mean, so the Japanese Americans actually made very, very tough choices, right, in terms of gaining acceptance in the United States, in terms of their compliance with the incarceration order, but then also by sort of the level of their sort of sacrifice and valor. I mean, what we call martial patriotism, by participating in the 442nd Military Battalion, which was posted to Italy and then also France. I mean, to this day, that regiment for a battalion of its size still has sort of the most honors and recognitions for bravery and sacrifice, right? And so those were the terms of Japanese sort of gaining recognition and acceptance of their loyalties, right? And things are already starting to shift. I date it all the way back already in terms of World War II, right? They're getting recognized. 1947, there is a form of an apology, right? And so Japanese Americans have won this acceptance. And then they're very quickly repositioned as, they've experienced discrimination, and yet they in fact become very accomplished in terms of educational attainment, in terms of employment, and sort of are held up as this model, particularly during the civil rights movement, right? And so that sort of sets the sort of the model for this. But even during the 19th century, when we have all of these racial stereotyping of Asians as a yellow peril, as coolie competition, we also have to say that we have very active American missionaries who are going to Asia, especially China, actually. China is the biggest field of U.S. international missionary activity. And missionaries really focus on trying to educate peoples in other countries, right? And so unlike the sort of belief in sort of essential racial differences, missionaries actually have this belief that you can convert Asians, right? That you have some sort of shared value in terms of sort of ethics and morality. There's a possibility of making Asians more like American Christians. They also have a strong belief, strong values in education. Right? And missionaries were also sort of very closely linked to higher education institutions in the United States. And so it's actually missionaries who will bring over the earliest Chinese to come to the United States to study in the United States. This actually dates all the way back to the 1820s, but we also have those seeds there as well. So it's, you know, it just sort of captures that. In fact, when we think about sort of how people thought about racial difference and different people from different countries and of different cultures, that there were actually a range of beliefs, and then also programs that develop in response to those beliefs.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. We have a question about how active the U.S. government was in sending Asians here on student visas back to their country of origin. If there was any kind of program where they wanted to she puts it in quotes, I will, to create friends in foreign countries, if there's any kind of intention behind that on the part of the U.S. government. That
is actually very explicit. So the Institute for International Education is established in 1919, and its founders are Elihu Root, who was a former Secretary of State, and Nicholas Murray, who was the president of Columbia University, and I think Stephen Butler. I think I'm getting that name wrong, actually. Stephen Murray. The original name for the institute, which was funded, I think, by it's either the Rockefeller or Carnegie Foundations. The first name for it was actually the Institute for International Relations, right? And so they understood actually that international education was, and I think this is sort of scaffolding on the activities of missionaries, on this understanding that if you can sort of educate the elite of other countries, bring them to the United States, sort of expose them to the benefits and the strengths of American civilization, right? You already have a sort of, it's also much cheaper than sending troops abroad. And then you send people back, right, to sort of lead and develop their countries. You know, we have this Pensionado program, which was implemented after the United States colonizes the Philippines. Chinese were brought over systematically through the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program as well. You know, Syngman Rhee, who will become the first president of Korea once it gains independence, was the first Korean to receive a PhD in the United States, right? And so this is already happening. There's also extensive programs like this with Latin American countries by the 1930s. I'm not as well informed about those, but this becomes much more a standard form of international outreach with 1945 and afterwards. We have the Fulbright-Hays programs going into operation in 1946, right? And so this has been understood actually to be a very effective way for the United States to cultivate better relationships, especially in developing nations.
Great, well, thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have. Madeline, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
We wanted to give one more thanks to our sponsors for this evening, Haynes and Boone and Northern Trust. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening and a happy and safe holiday weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Good night. Good night.
Have a good night.